but it wasn't any emergency powers, because there are no emergency powers that are in violation of the Constitution. They're not powers at all. They're violations of the law, and and violations of the law are not powers, right? But it was emergency. What happened was there was a war between the states. And the first battle of that war was fought in a place called Bull Run in Manassas, Virginia. Now, if you go down to that battlefield, there's a film they show you. It's very interesting. It's an interesting story. It was the general consensus in Washington, D.C., that the war shouldn't last any more than a couple hours. And what happened was all the congressmen and the dignitaries took their ladies in carriages, and they took lunch baskets, and they had a picnic on the hills overlooking the battlefield to watch the battle. And in fact, the first part of the battle was going that way. All right? And the Confederate troops could not hold the field. They kept falling back. And Thomas Jonathan Jackson was a colonel, and he had a brigade there, and his brigade was held in reserve. And in front of him, facing the Union troops, was General B of South Carolina. And General B could not keep his men from retreating. He tried everything he knew. And Thomas Jonathan Jackson was a very devout Presbyterian. In fact, he used to preach all the time in the camps and all. And he really was a Presbyterian in every sense of the word. He believed in predestination. And he believed in the Lord. And he believed that when his time come, he was going to go. So he had no fear of anything. And every battle he participated in, he would sit erect on his horse. And many balls would fly all around him. And he would just sit there and watch the battle and use his strategies. And so he was doing that there. He had all his men laying behind this knoll on the ground on their bellies. And he told them to fix their bayonets. And they lay there with their bayonets. And General B, trying to rally his troops, he said to his men, he says, "Look, men, look at Jackson. He's standing like a stone wall. Rally round, resist, men. Charge," you see. And as soon as he said that, he took a mini ball between his eyes and it killed him instantly. He fell from his horse and his men retreated. And Jackson had given his men orders, when the South Carolinians retreat past you and the Union troops are upon you, you are to jump up and scream and yell and charge with your bayonets. So that actually happened. And when they charged with the bayonets, the Union troops were so surprised, didn't know what to do. They dropped their weapons and ran in panic. And all the war material was left on the field. And the troops went, and they were disorganized. The army was totally disorganized. General Beauregard, General Johnston, and Colonel Jackson went to Jefferson Davis, and they said, "Shall we move into Washington, secure the city, and arrest Lincoln?" Because there was no army to stop them. It was totally gone. And Jefferson Davis told them that no troops of the Confederate States of America were to enter and invade a foreign soil. They are to protect their soil only. Jackson was so distraught over this decision that he resigned his commission. And it took him a better part of the year to talk him back into the Confederate Army. Now, what happened to the Union? Let's look at what happened to the Union then. They used their gold that was in the treasury to put this army together. It was gone. They had to reorganize another army. They needed money. They couldn't. They had to do it fast. They didn't know when an invasion was going to come. They didn't know what was going on. And they couldn't wait to put a tax out. The only way they could tax is a direct tax. It might take 6 months to even tax, right? So I believe, from my study of the period, and the conspiracy that I believe existed, that the bankers who instigated that war and had their agents in both governments, both administrations, because when you research it, you'll find that the Secretary of State for the Confederacy, there's papers that have been brought forward where he misdirected supplies and everything to bring about the defeat of the Confederacy, number one. And number two, after the war was over, he was taken to England by the Rothschilds and lived out his life in a mansion over there as a gift from them. And they don't do that for nothing. And then in Lincoln's cabinet, some of these men who were also agents of the bankers went to Lincoln and they said, we have some friends who can set up a banking system where you have all the money you want. Which they were talking about what? A Federal Reserve System that took 1913 to get. And Lincoln said, well, no, I don't know about that. So he came and went to some congressmen and senators, and he got them to introduce a bill to create Lincoln greenbacks, United States notes, which was debt-free money. Totally debt-free, based on the credit of the United States, but totally illegal. Right? But they were interest-free, and they said they were payable on demand at any bank. Or Treasury United States. It was Treasury United States, but any national bank, and just Treasury United States. And in Oregon, these Lincoln greenbacks, as they were called, were collected by the tax collector in response to this direct tax that was apportioned to Oregon. And the treasurer of the state of Oregon refused to accept them. Because of what? Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. They refused. And you know what happened? The Supreme Court upheld the state of Oregon. But after that, we've had a series of cases which they call the legal tender cases. From that point on, where you can, if you read them, you can see the history of where the courts use sophistry, right, to change the Constitution to what it really says, to what it doesn't really say, and put that into practice. All right? And that's how we got paper money. That's the story of paper money. So that's what they meant. That's what Sherman meant. You know, it's like Jefferson says, you know, you bind men's mischiefs with the chains of the Constitution. Well, today we have those chains so elastic, and I mean, you know, we can't bind anybody. What we got to do is we got to put some more starch into them, right, and bring them back into shape. Now, what we have here is Article 6, Clause 2. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. All right, now, they can pass GATT and all these other treaties and do away with the Constitution, right?
No way.
Huh? Can they?
No way. They're violating the Constitution every time they do something like that.
Well, I hear, you know, you got a lot of these political, I don't know what to call them, political pirates. These guys who send letters to everybody. You know, send me 1,000, send me 500, send me 250, send me 25. Other. Right? We have to defeat this treaty because it's going to overturn the Constitution. We'll no longer have a Constitution. Well, what does Article 6, Clause 2 say? Can a treaty overturn the Constitution? No, a treaty can only be made under the authority of the United States. What is the authority of the United States? The Constitution. Don't let these guys pull the wool over your eyes. And don't give them any money. They don't deserve it. They're a bunch of crooks. I mean, some of these guys make a living, they become wealthy over that kind of thing. Taking advantage of people's ignorance of the law. Look, these are the rules in which we live by, and you can't play the game of life unless you understand the rules. So that's the first thing you have to do is understand the rules. To aid in that, one of our members here has put together and re-edited a constitutional catechism. If you get our newsletter, you can find it within the newsletter. I would advise that to your children, your grandchildren. Try to get it in your public schools. Take it to your school board. We have to understand the Constitution. I mean, this is the type of thing that we want to get into the schools. Even the teachers, they don't know what they're doing when it comes to this. This is a way of correcting things. I mean, this is our opportunity. We're getting people's attention now because they see how corrupt government is. It can't be hidden anymore. Good Lord, when you have a president who's a chief suspect in I don't know how many murders, I mean, the people are saying, what's going on in this country? Anybody who's a witness who can put him in some kind of a unpleasant situation commits suicide all of a sudden. I mean, they got more suicides of his friends. I would never be a friend of his. Good Lord, it's dangerous, right? But we have, the name, I can't say it enough, the name of the game is education. They have to understand. Oh, here we have it. Here it is. This is what changed it all, right? Amendment 16. The Congress shall have power. Now it's different from Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, right? Congress doesn't have the power there. They can only send it to the states, right? But under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, Congress has power, right? And here Congress has power here too. To lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. Changed it all, right?
No.
It looks like it.
No.
It appears that way. But did it?
No.
Well, why didn't it?
Because Congress cannot alter the Constitution. From with the limitations alone, it can exercise its power. You cannot.
Well, they can change the Constitution. Sure, they can amend it.
Well,
The Constitution can be changed by amendment. Did this amendment change it? Sure, they alter it with the amendment. Can this, did this amendment change it? Yes, Sally.
Well, it didn't cancel the previous statement, and it doesn't contradict it, and it doesn't add any new powers.
All right, that's a good point. So here we have Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, which is direct taxes. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, which is indirect taxes. Well, does this fall in one or the other categories, or is this a whole new category of taxation?
Whole new one, because
It's a whole new one.
Looks like it's right.
that's from the looks of it.
All right. So the question is it a new one, or which category does it fall in? Because nowhere in there can I find the word indirect or direct. Can you? It just says taxes. It doesn't say if it's direct or indirect, and we have these categories that they have to fall into. All right, now, if Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 was changed by this, then somewhere in this it has to say that it changed that, right? But it doesn't say that, does it? Yeah, it would have to say repeal it or amend it. And it doesn't say neither. So it didn't repeal it, it didn't amend it. Well then, what did it do? If the direct taxes are still apportioned, but this says that Congress can lay an income tax without apportionment. What the world did this thing do?
Did it make non-resident aliens pay the taxes?
I don't know. Where do you get that from?
I think on the face it makes
Huh?
I think on the face it makes tax law void for vagueness.
You think? No, the Constitution isn't void for vagueness, but it doesn't say that because it would have to have the word direct in there, but it doesn't. Or it would have the word indirect in there, but it doesn't. But it does say what? That it's without apportionment and it's on incomes. So there's the two key terms, right? You have apportionment and you have incomes. Now we got to investigate these terms. And then we got to see how they apply within the 16th Amendment to see what it actually did. All right, now, in order to do that, we have to go find this. Now, most politicians that are elected today, how do they get elected? What do they do in most of them? Well, there they lie, that's true. Let's say that I wanted to run for office, and I'm a man of modest means. In fact, I'm a pauper. But yet I wanted to run for office. What chance would I have to get elected? And how would I go about getting the opportunity to get elected? Well, first of all, I would join a political club. Then I would become active in that political club, right? I'd do a lot of favors. I'd be John the nice guy. Everybody likes John because everybody likes people who give them things or do things for them or compliment them, as long as it's not overdone. So we hold it within the bounds, and I do these things. And all of a sudden, I let the word get around that I'd like to run for this office. And then I have two or three of them say, oh, John's a nice guy. We'll back John. Then John gets all the money from that, whatever that is, the party, from their treasury, to promote me. So don't cost me a dime, right? I get the public's endorsement, the party's endorsement. I run for the office. I get elected. I run for another office, and I keep going up, and I spread my favors out. Then once I'm in office, my favors spread into the business community, right? I let them take me out, wine and dine me. I make sure that they get a tax break in their corporation with private tax law. Do all these things, right? By doing these things and not applying the law and not really studying the law, what do I know about the law? How to use it to my own advantage, right? That's it. And that's what most of them are there. They don't know what the law is. It's not taught in the schools. They work their way up through a crony system of favors and giving out jobs and things of this nature. So how in the world do they know what's going on? In 79, to make a long story short, in 79, a lot of people wrote in, I was one of them, we wrote letters in to our congressmen and senators, and we asked them about the 16th Amendment. And we asked them what the 16th Amendment did. We knew. And we were asking them. We wanted them to tell us. Well, what happened was they didn't know. So what they did was they wrote to the Library of Congress and they asked for a research study. Now in the Library of Congress, they have what they call, right down here, the Congressional Research Service. Because they knew they had to set this up because they got a bunch of people who don't even know what the law is and they got to be brought along. You know, congressmen don't even write the bills. You know who writes the bills, don't you? The lawyers, the aides are lawyers who they employ. Congressmen come and go and the aides stay from one to the other. Who's actually running your government? The staff, right? The lawyers. And they have lawyers working here. This particular one in the Congressional Research Service is Howard Zaritsky. See? And in 1979, he gave his report number 79-131A. Some constitutional questions regarding federal income tax laws. He's a legislative attorney, American Law Division, Library of Congress, Congressional Research Service. His report date is May 25th, 1979. So what did he say about the same questions I just asked you about the 16th Amendment? This is his report right here, and he comes out on page 3. He has the 16th Amendment provides that the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, without regard to census enumeration. Zaritsky says in Pershaber versus Union Pacific Railroad Company, Volume 240, United States Reports, which are Supreme Court cases, page 1, year 1916, the Supreme Court held that the income tax, including a tax on dealings in property, was an indirect tax rather than a direct tax. And that now this is the words of the court, command, notice that's starting with small case. You see it? Not starting with a capital. Why is that?
Taken in the middle of the sentence.
That's right. That's some sentence, isn't it? You see any periods in here? You don't see any, do you? That's some sentence, isn't it? Why do you think anybody would want to write a sentence that long? I mean, if you ever read any books on how to write, or somebody's ever given you training in writing, what do they tell you? Brief, short sentences. Is that right, Andrea?
Yeah, don't want unwieldy ones.
That's right. Is that right, Professor? Okay. All right. So you have short sentences. Man, why would anybody want to write a sentence like that? The middle of it must be 60 words to make it clear. Huh? I don't think so. All right. What does the court say? The command of the amendment that all income taxes shall not be subject to the rule of apportionment by a consideration of the source from which the taxed income may be derived. See up here it says without apportionment. So that means the amendment is saying that the income tax will not be apportioned because it's without apportionment. That's what they're saying right there, right? May be derived. Forbids the application to such taxes of the rule applied in the Pollock case. Everybody know what the Pollock case was about? What are they referring to about there?
Direct taxes also, right?
Yeah, but what was the Pollock case all about?
I think was that the time that the Congress attempted to lay a tax on dividends or interest on savings accounts?
Yeah, it was an income tax. It was an income tax that Congress passed in 1894. Man, what's this? 1994. 100 years ago, Congress passed a direct income tax, which taxed property directly. Right? Now, the court's talking about the Pollock case. The Pollock case decided that, and they said Farmers Loan and Trust Company would have to withhold the income tax on the interest and dividends that they paid to their depositors. They said it was an unconstitutional tax. They set it aside because it was a direct tax on property and without apportionment. All direct taxes have to be apportioned. Now the court's bringing that very thing up. What is it saying here? Forbids the application to such taxes of the rule applied in the Pollock case. So when it's without apportionment, it's in the indirect category, the court's saying, and therefore it's not a direct tax, and that was forbidden in the Pollock case because it was a direct tax. Everybody understanding that? All right, now, is it clear? Clear as mud?
No,
He said finally.
That's it, clear as mud.
Well, anything you don't understand, we'll take the time and explain it now.
Go over once more now, it'll sink in.
All right, now, in the Pollock case, right, there was a case against direct taxation passed by Congress of an income tax. In other words, Congress passed a law that they laid an income tax on interest and dividends of domestic banks. the deposits of citizens in domestic banks or even resident aliens, right? And the court struck it down as a direct tax without apportionment in violation of Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. Because it taxed the interest and dividends directly. All right? Now, the 16th Amendment says without apportionment, from whatever source derived, without apportionment. Okay? Among the several states. So the court's saying because the 16th Amendment says it's without apportionment, that means it's an indirect tax, all right? And it forbids the application of the tax that was tried in the Pollock case, which is a direct tax, without apportionment. You follow it now? All right. Now, by which alone such taxes were removed from the great class of excise duties and imposts, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, right? Subject to the rule of uniformity, and were placed in the other direct class. And that's why the Supreme Court knocked them down in 1895 and said they were unconstitutional because they were a direct tax. Everybody understand that now? Huh? Vicki, you know?
I don't know how many times I've heard this, John, and I'm still confused, but...
All right. If the Congress taxes property directly, it has to be what? Apportioned. That means that the income tax, as written, is without apportionment. So therefore, it cannot be a direct tax. How many categories of taxation are there?
Two. Direct and indirect.
So if it's not direct, it has to be what?
Indirect.
If it's indirect, then can it be laid directly on the property?
No.
In the Pollock case, Congress laid a tax directly, and the court struck it down as unconstitutional. So they're saying that the Supreme Court is saying the only thing the 16th Amendment did was to make sure that the income tax was indirect. That's all it did. They said all this to say that it's indirect and that it cannot be laid directly on your property. So what does that mean?
16th Amendment.
Huh?
It means something about the 16th Amendment.
Okay, we'll agree to that. Thank you, Madam School Teacher. All right.
This is disobeying the Constitution.
Sir?
The IRS is disobeying the Constitution.
No. No, that's the first conclusion that you jumped to. Earlier this evening I said beware of jumping to conclusions. Right? The IRS is, or the Congress is not disobeying the Constitution. The tax laws are totally constitutional. Totally constitutional. So with that in mind, we're going to have to go forward and find out what we're talking about. But before we do that, let's go down in the same year, so according to Mr. Zaritsky, in the same year, 1916, the same volume of the United States Reports, 240, on pages 18 and 19, it is recorded, this view was reiterated by the court in Stanton versus Baltic Mining Company, in which the court stated that the 16th Amendment conferred no new power of taxation. Is that clear? Huh? But simply prohibited the previous and complete and plenary power of income taxation possessed by Congress from when?
Beginning.
From the beginning. So Congress always had the power to lay an income tax. Well, why did they have the 16th Amendment? To make it clear how it was to be laid. Without apportionment, meaning that it's indirect and it cannot be used directly. All right? From being taken out of the category of indirect taxation to which it inherently belonged. Well, that raises the question. I asked a lot of people, I said, when was the first Income Tax Act? And I get people telling me all the time. Sometimes I ask this on the air. I did a show out in California. I wasn't there, I was on the phone, of course. And this accountant got on there, it was a talk show. And I love it when accountants and CPAs and tax attorneys get on. You can really have a lot of fun with them. And he got on there, and I said to him, I said, well, sir, you're an accountant, you deal with taxes all the time. Can you tell me when we first got an income tax? He says, it was 1913. Right? I said, well, I'm afraid not. When did we get the first income tax? Well, evidently we got one in 1894, which was declared unconstitutional and never imposed. We got that one right. But when was the first one?
1862.
1862.
That's correct, 1862. The first act was passed on August the 5th, 1861, but it was never imposed. We did an article on this in one of our newsletters some years ago, explaining the whole thing. The August 5th Act of 1861 was actually on the pay of Army officers during the war between the states. And of course, everybody realized after it was passed that it was unconstitutional. But you could understand when they first passed it, because it was the first income tax ever passed, and a lot of the congressmen didn't understand that. But it must have been brought to their attention because they repealed it a year later and replaced it with Section 89. And in Section 89, what did they call it?
Income duty.
Income duty? How many of you received your income duty returns last year? Huh? How many of you received their income duty returns last year? All right. Now, you say, well, where did I come up with this thing at? Well, you go down to the law library, and this is what's called a statute at large. I know what a statute at large is? All right. How do the laws come about? I heard this guy from Texas. What's his name? A famous congressman, Graham. Phil Graham. I heard Phil Graham on the radio the other day being interviewed. And Phil Graham made the statement that Mitchell was Senator Mitchell from Maine was kind of dishonest because he has this health bill that's volumes, right, and thousands of pages that he doesn't want anybody to read, he just wants them to pass it. And of course, a lot of people are saying that it's actually Clinton's bill with a name change, which might be or might not, I don't know. But the point that I'm making is it's thousands of pages. When a law is passed, most of them are that way. They're like this. But yet, when you look at them in the law books, they're a paragraph. Now, how in the world do they get those volumes down to a paragraph? Do you ever think about that? I used to think about that all the time. I said, how do they do that? Right? Well, I guess Ollie North, maybe he knows. I don't know. Right? But what actually happens is that Congress passes this monstrosity, and they get a lot of riders on it, and that riders fill it up. You know what riders are? Everybody knows what riders are, right? Riders are usually pork barrel. Right? In other words, let's say I'm a congressman from Maryland, and I'm from Carroll County here. So what I want to do is build some big pork project in Carroll County so that I can employ a lot of my friends and put them on the dole, man, and hand it out, boy. Give them cushy jobs, high-paying cushy jobs, put a lot of underlings below them and build this thing up. So, you have a highway bill, and I'm saying, let me put my project on your bill. And then some guy who wants to put another project on there and rides along. Of course, these projects are not even, people don't even know because they're not even in the title of the bill. Right? But when they come out, you got all kinds of laws in there. That's like some years ago, the Philadelphia Inquirer, might have been like 4 or 5 years ago, exposed Rostenkowski where he was passing, putting into these tax bills, private tax law. In other words, it didn't name anybody. It just said the resident of 404 Maple Lane, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, is exempt from this law. That's what he had. I mean, they were publishing this. I mean, it was all cut. So you go to Rostenkowski, and you give him 50 grand, and you're exempt from taxes. You know, and he would put your name in there, or a person born on so-and-so date at so-and-so address is exempt. And that's exactly what he was doing. I mean, that guy's a real artist. But anyway, so they have to separate. Well, how in the world does this thing go into the law library? I mean, if we had, every law was passed, was that thick, the law libraries would be miles and miles long. Well, what actually happens is, in the archives of the United States, there's a division called the Records Division. And they employ lawyers there who take these monstrosities and they render them down to what is called a statute at large. Out of all those pages, they take the law that was intended and they rewrite it, right, and call it an act of Congress, when Congress's act was nothing like it. All right? And then they publish these things in books called statutes at large, and they're published by the date the law was passed. And this is the first that they started keeping record of law in the United States that way. So it stands to reason, after a while they keep passing laws, you know, they think it's their job, and they keep doing this, that there were so many laws, in order for people to live, they had to go down there and try to figure out, is any law against what I'm doing today? And how do they know that? Because they would have to know that the law in the beginning and know the date before they could find it. So this presented a problem. So to solve the problem, they came up with what is called codification of the law. In other words, they took all the laws and they kept recording them and publishing them as to the date they were passed, but they also took them and they recodified them into codes which are topical. There are 50 titles to the United States Code, such as all the laws that were passed pertaining to banking. They would take all of them and put them in Title 12. All the laws pertaining to money, they would take them and put them in Title 31. Armed Forces, 10. Government agencies and employees, 5. 29 is labor, totally unconstitutional. And some others, right? Title 26 is what? Internal Revenue Code. Title 27 is what? Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Okay? So that's what they would do. Now, when these same lawyers in the Records Division that created the statutes at large create the codes, of course they radically change them. Because now they got to put them in subtitles according to where they fit, so they can be easily found, and they cross-reference them. So they radically change all the words, which might change the intent of Congress. Right? So that means that Congress has to examine the code and then pass it as a whole as their act. They call that passing it into positive law. Any title that is not passed into positive law, passed by Congress, is not passed into positive law. Now, when you go to the index of the code and you open it up, you'll find that it says ones with an asterisk were not passed into positive law. And one of them that wasn't passed is Title 26, Internal Revenue Code. Now, some people jumped to a conclusion some years ago and said, oh, it's not the law, it's not the act of Congress. That's it. And they started running to court and arguing these things. They started telling people this is the new silver bullet. Internal Revenue Law is not positive law, therefore it's void. Hogwash.
That idea is still prevalent today.
It's ludicrous. The Internal Revenue Code was written in its entirety in 1861 as it was codified. Therefore, it didn't have to be codified because it was already an act of Congress and remains unchanged since then. And this is, you're looking at part of it right here. This is part of it. So if you want to prove me wrong, you go down to the statutes at large and you pull it out and look up August 1861 and you'll find income duty. All right? That's what you find there. Now again, I say to you, did you receive from the Internal Revenue Service your income duty return last year? Should have. Yes, sir.
If these statutes at large are just pretty much a rewrite of the actual law.
No, they're not the rewrite. Well, they are a rewrite, right? That's the gray area. I'm sorry, they're a rewrite from what Congress wrote to begin with.
The point is that these lawyers are, I don't know, condensing the actual law.
That's right.
Is the statute at large considered law?
It's considered the act of Congress. In other words,
Even though it's different from the intent of Congress.
That's right. In other words, if you go to court, the court is duty bound to recognize the statutes at large before it is the code.
Can you break that down, starting with the Constitution? How that, we have the one page, which is the
Yeah,
Constitution.
right. Well, that's right.
It starts expanding.
And it starts expanding. That's right. We usually do that when we get to the manual.
Oh, okay.
Right.
What happens to the actual law then?
Huh?
What happens to that great big book then after we do this?
Well, I don't know. Maybe they have a deal with Ollie North. I don't know. I have no idea. I imagine. I never have done this, but I imagine you can go to the Library of Congress and dig them out somewhere. They would have them all over there.
John, Chris said that when this is condensed, that it changes the meaning from the expanded version. That's not necessarily the case. It could be, and that's the reason it has to be voted on by Congress.
Well,
correct?
that's the code.
Yeah.
Right. So they have to review it so they see that it's actually their act and not changed.
Right.
They don't review it. Their aides do. Yeah, right. But that's what's supposed to
But
be.
that is the purpose in them voting on it, is to verify that it has not been changed from what they intended originally.
That's correct. For the code, not the statute at large.
Right.
So the statute at large is actually voted on?
The statute at large is considered the act of Congress. The code is recognized as being changed radically, not supposedly to its intent, but to its composition, so that it can fit into the code topically and be applied that way. You see what I'm saying? In other words, you have a statute at large, and you go by the dates, and the laws are all mixed at different topics, and they're hard to find. But when you codify them, you put them in topics, you know exactly what code to go to for whatever topic you want to see what the law says. And then you can go through that title itself, which is the topic, and you can break down, in other words, the Internal Revenue Code, Title 26, right? It's divided into 10 subtitles. See? So those subtitles are topical. In other words, any law that was passed by Congress regarding income tax would be in Subtitle A of Title 26, Chapters 1 through 6. So it has to be rewritten to fit into that topic. You see what I'm saying? Any law regarding alcohol, tobacco, firearms would be in Subtitle E. See?
We'll see that later.
Yeah, you'll see that later, but you follow what I'm saying. So that in order to get that in there, they change and Congress has to review them. The only one that didn't was the Internal Revenue Code, because it was written as though it was codified.
So when they codify it, they could change meaning by putting it in a wrong,
Well, they have to change the composition of the thing to make it fit in there and go with the other provisions that implement the tax that way, and then Congress has to review it and say that's the way we intended it to be implemented.
Otherwise, you go by the statutes at large.
Right. See what I'm saying? Well, the court goes by the statute at large anyway. If you go cite a code section and your opponent cites a statute at large, the court's supposed to ignore you and go to the statute at large, or even you. Statute at large actually in court supersedes the code sections. Okay? All right, so what do we have here? We have an income duty now. Well, that doesn't make sense for the income tax as we know it, right? You know, whenever I do a radio talk show, I have more fun by making one statement. And I always try to start off with this statement somehow. And that is, believe it or not, any citizen living and working in the states of the Union has never paid an income tax in his life. And it's totally true. People say, are you kidding? You're silly. I'll pay more income tax. You have never paid an income tax in your life. And that's totally true. Right? And that's what we're about to try to show you, possibly this evening. I don't know. All right, now, what does it say? An act to provide increased revenue from imports to pay interest on the public debt and for other purposes. Now, you got an income tax, right, that is for the purpose of increasing revenue from imports. Maybe that's why they call it income duty. Interesting, isn't it? How in the world do you apply an income tax on imports? Well, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 is on impost, excise, right, and duties. And this is talking about a tax on imports, right? What do they mean by that? Anybody have any idea? I mean, it's not the tax as you know it, is it? Huh?
Income from foreign.
In other words,
Tariffs on
duty
imports,
means
too.
for imports, et cetera, right?
All right, well, that's what it said. Increase revenue from imports. They laid an income tax to increase revenue from imports. All right, well, maybe this will explain it. What we have here is called TD 2313. That means Treasury Decision. 2313. From the Treasury Department, Office of Commissioner of Internal Revenue. The date of it is March 21st, 1916. It's to collectors of internal revenue from the commissioner. And he says, under the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States in the case of Bershaber versus Union Pacific Railroad Company, decided January 24th, 1916, it is hereby held that income occurring to United States citizens in the form of interest.
Hold on there.
Huh?
Hold on, that's,
Huh?
Get those glasses.
What?
Get those glasses.
yep, get your glasses. You misstated a little bit.
All right, let me go. All right, decided January 24th, it is hereby held that income occurring, non-resident aliens. Income occurring to non-resident aliens in the form of interest from the bonds and dividends of the stock of domestic corporations is subject to the income tax imposed by the Act of October 3rd, 1913. Now, what do we have? We have Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company. It said that Congress could not lay a direct tax on interest and dividends of the proper United States citizens, right?
Right.
Never been overturned. The Bershaber case I showed you referred back to Pollock, right? And now the commissioner says that the only way they're going to lay a tax on interest and dividends is from non-resident aliens. Is that right? That's what they're saying. Let's go on. The responsible heads agents or representatives of non-resident aliens who are in charge of the property owned or business carried on within the United States shall make a full and complete return of income, the income therefrom, on Form 1040. Revised, and shall pay any and all tax, normal and additional, assessed upon the income received by them in behalf of their non-resident alien principal. You understand now?
That's your income tax, right?
All right, the case was Bershaber versus Union Pacific Railroad Company. If you read the case, it says Frank Bershaber was a citizen of Brooklyn, New York. Right? And it said that Frank Bershaber had to pay the income tax. Nowhere in the case can you find the words non-resident alien or your principal non-resident alien. Think the court was a little deceptive? Huh? Because the commissioner told the agents how to collect it. He didn't say go down and collect it from Frank Bershaber. He said collect it from the non-resident alien who Frank Bershaber was an agent for. It wasn't Frank Bershaber's money. It was the alien's money he was handling. He was a withholding agent. And he filed suit on behalf of his non-resident alien principal.
The looks of the case, it looks like he's a
It looks like
all-American Joe having to pay his income.
his own taxes. But you got to put it together with what the commissioner says to the collectors. Everybody say? Huh? Not only that, of course, Pollock's never been overturned. So it stands to reason it can't be citizens because Pollock already struck that down. Now, a lot of you heard where some of these congressmen and senators are saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to fix it and make it easy for people. We're going to create a national sales tax. Man. Right? How does that go? Liar, liar, pants on fire.
Now they're pushing for a flat tax also.
Well, in 1991, I was invited to Denver, Colorado, to participate in a tax, for a better word, convention out there. And at that convention, they had this lawyer who came there who was promoting a national sales tax. The same ones that they're trying to pass over there. So I was selected to debate him over this. And I said, well, how is this tax to be collected? He says, well, from the citizens. I said, in other words, if I manufacture something and I sell it to you, I got to collect the tax from you. He said, that's correct. I said, well, how is this tax to be reported? He says, by return. I said, well, didn't you say when you first got here that this was going to do away with the Internal Revenue Service? And he said, yes. I said, well, if the tax has to be reported by return, who are you going to report it to, your congressman? Right? I mean, it's so ludicrous. Right? So now I received from one of our members a copy of a letter he wrote to Senator Nunn, who introduced the so-called sales tax in the Senate. He wrote him a letter asking him about it, and then Senator Nunn answered him, and I had he sent me a copy of both letters. And Nunn said that, well, it really isn't a sales tax. What we're going to do is we're going to relieve the taxpayer by doing away with the tax on the interest and dividends and savings.
Oh, yeah.
Which
You know,
has already been done away with?
So I wrote to Senator Nunn about a month and a half ago, and one of the questions I asked him was, I thought Pollock did away with that. You know? When did it come back? Right? Could you please tell me this? You know? But he said in his letter, I'll make some, we might publish this letter in the newsletter, but he said in his letter that it's actually an income tax, and it always will be. Well, you know, it stands to reason. It stands to reason it has to be. Why is that? Because when you have a debt money system with a Federal Reserve Bank, you have to have a tax that takes the excessive amount of paper off the market. If you don't have a tax that takes the excessive amount of paper off the market, what happens? You have the same condition that existed with the Continentals. People will be wallpapering their walls with the paper money. They won't be able to spend it. You know, we published in our newsletter some of the hearings that were during World War II when they talked about the withholdings tax. That was the first withholdings tax was 1943, right? And here in all the hearings where they're going to bring about a withholdings tax, they said that taxes are not to raise revenue. We passed that. The government has passed that plateau. Taxes are to create the demand deposits and to keep the bank in operation so that people don't know the excessive amount of credit that's being issued. You understand? I mean, it's well documented. I mean, it's been declassified, and now anybody can go down and read it. So they openly admitted that taxes are not to raise revenue. You don't raise revenue when you're in perpetual debt.
Right. And I think that's another reason for the income tax situation is if it takes the money out of circulation, which is true, but it gives the perception that we're paying the expenses of government when in essence we're actually paying the interest on that money to begin with. I think it would be much easier for people to understand if that wasn't the way they collected it. If you actually had to go down and pay interest, you'd know you were paying interest.
I agree with that, but it's mind-boggling because you sit down and think they create debt money from nothing, they charge interest on it, then they collect the debt money and to pay interest on that over again. So debt on debt on debt, paying debt on debt on debt. You know, and somewhere you go, wow.
And to top it all off, people don't realize that it's the indirect taxes that pay for running the government, not the direct taxes.
That's correct. But they don't even do that now because what the government does is they borrow everything they need, and the taxes that are collected don't even pay the interest on what they borrow. So you're in perpetual debt, and you have been for the last couple of years. You're beyond payment. It's perpetual now.
And they do it with worthless paper, right?
Well, they do it with say-so. They do it with say-so of a few banking families. I say it's good, and therefore it's my say-so. And that's all it is. It's their word that we're spending. And their credit, which is their word. And that's it. So these families have something going for them. I'd love to be able to create out of nothing and have all you come to borrow from me and pay me interest and enrich me. Right? I mean, that's equal protection under the law, according to the 14th Amendment. Isn't that right? You know, speaking of that, in 1975, I sent a letter to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C., and I sent them a money order for $5 some odd cents, and I ordered, 1,100 note denomination Federal Reserve notes. And I told them it was my first order, and that they didn't have to deliver. If they wanted, I'd come down and pick it up. And I said I was doing this because the 14th Amendment says everybody has equal protection of the law, and being that the Federal Reserve is a private corporation and not a government agency, and I'm a private person, then I have the same right to purchase these notes as they do. Isn't that correct? So anyway, I received the letter back without a signature, telling me that by law they can only sell the notes to the Federal Reserve. I wrote back, I tried to get somebody to put their name to something, I could sue them, but nobody would do it. But anyway, you have some fun, go ahead and order some notes. And you know, it's an education in itself to show you how ridiculous the whole thing is. All right, now, a lot of you have heard the term illegal or tax protester. And like we've told you before, all legal terms are defined. They have to be defined. The law has to be defined. We'll get into that a little deeper a little later on. And what is an illegal tax protester? You know, I read articles in the paper about myself, and they call me a tax protester. And I'm on a talk show sometimes, somebody will call and say, "Oh, you're just a tax protester." And then I would say, "Well, what is a tax protester? Can you tell me?" It's just what the words say it is. Remember back during the Vietnam War, some people thought that they didn't want to pay for that war. So they would file a tax return, and then they would deduct part of them taxes from that, and they would write on there, I'm deducting some of these taxes and not paying them because I don't want to contribute to the war. Well, they would be a tax protester. Now, this is defined by the IRS in the Internal Revenue Manual at 5431.4, Chapter 5400 of the Internal Revenue Manual. Can everybody see that? 5400 is the Service Center Collection Branch Procedures, okay? And it talks about illegal tax protester scheme definitions rather. And you'll notice down through, it's 11 of them in total, and they all are the same thing, where you're filing a return and entering a protest on the return. You're protesting a tax. Well, if no one files the return, then they cannot be a tax protester because you're not entering anything at any time to the government. See? It's just that simple. And this is constantly being misused by the media due to their ignorance in most cases. Of course, in some cases, it's not. I had a lady from the Sun paper come out here and spent 2 days with me one time, and I must have showed her this 4 times in 2 days, and she still put tax protester in the paper, knowing what she was saying wasn't true. So in some cases, they just want to destroy you with what Lenin called invective, by name calling, to put you in a certain category where nobody wants to get near you. Of course, 200 years ago, that was an honor to be a tax protester. Things change, I guess, over the years. So anyway, knowing what we know now, and some people having shorter fuses than others, you might say, I've heard enough. That's it. They'll never see another return from me. I've talked to those people for the last time, that's it. And you stop filing returns. Then a year or 2 goes by, and then you get a letter, right? And the letter says, we have no record of receiving a return from you. And you, oh my, now what? Oh my, now what? That letter is called a TDI, Taxpayer Delinquency Investigation. And they have to send you out a Notice 609 with that letter. And a lot of times I'll receive calls in here where people, they receive these letters and they get all upset and excited, particularly if they're not members. And they'll call up here and they'll say, man, you got to help me. I got this letter. What do I do? What do I do with it? And I'll say to them, well, did they send you a Notice 609? And they'll say, well, what's that? I'll say, that's that little sheet of paper about 1/5 the size of a letter-sized piece of paper. And you'll hear them digging in the round file, Oh, yeah, I got that right here. Well, why do you think the IRS makes this thing about 1/5 the letter-sized piece of paper? Probably for the same reason that a utility company makes a notice for a hearing before the Public Service Commission for the increase of rates about yay big, even smaller than this, with maybe a 5 fine. where you need a magnifying glass to read it. They don't want you to go there and complain about the rates going up, right? They want you to just chuck it away. And most people, when they see something small, they think of it as being insignificant and just chuck it. They don't even bother looking at it. So the same thing goes here. But this really isn't significant. This here tells us a lot. And we're going to examine it right now. Notice 609. I like this particular one for the year 1986 because it was the first year that they put on this notice, the Paperwork Reduction Act. In fact, the Paperwork Reduction Act was passed in 1980, as it says right here, and the IRS didn't obey it till 1986. I think that's very significant, which we'll see a little later on. It says Notice 609 is the Privacy Act Paperwork Reduction Act notice. Under the Privacy Act of 1974 and the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1980, we must tell you our legal right to ask for information and whether the law says you must give it. So they have to send this to you, and they have to tell you what their right is to ask you for the information and whether the law says that you must respond to them or not. Now notice before 1974, they didn't have to do that. So how many years did they have there? Many a year, from 43, the average citizen started filing returns in 1944 for the year 43, right? That was the first year for withholdings, 1943. And they've been filing them ever since, and the government just sends them to them. They, without saying you had to do this or anything, there was no questions asked. They just did it. But in 1974, the Congress passed the Privacy Act, which said that any time an agency asks any information from any citizen, they got to tell them the authority for it. Now, they also went one step further in 1980 with the Paperwork Reduction Act, which we'll go into more detail a little later on. Now, we'll skip down here to see what they say their legal right is. It says, our legal right to ask for information is Internal Revenue Code sections 6001, 6011, and 6012A and their regulations. Now, this is the first year, 1986, that they added 6012A. Before 86, they only had the two code sections, 6001 and 6011. We've written them quite often, asking them what event took place in 1986 for you to add 6012A to the Privacy Act notice. And never received a response. Something had to occur, didn't it, or else it would have been there before, wouldn't you say? Well, anyway, it goes on to say, they say that you must file a return or statement with us for any tax you are liable for. Then it goes on to say, Code Section 6109 and its regulations say that you must show your Social Security number on what you file. Now, anybody have any arguments with that? No. I mean, I have no argument with that. If you're filing a return, you have a Social Security number, you're supposed to use it. Nothing wrong with that. Now, can anybody tell me the difference between sentence 1 and sentence 2 of their legal right? There's a big difference there. Can anybody see it? No.
6109, they're not required to mention it?
No, 6109 is a Social Security number. Now, I'm talking about the first two sentences now. Let's go over them again. Aaron, look at these sentences carefully. We're going to go over them one more time. There's a big difference between the two. Our legal right to ask for information is Internal Revenue Code section 6001, 6011, and 6012A and their regulations. They say that you must file a return or statement with us for any tax you are liable for.
Now, there's a big difference there.
Yes,
no you in the first sentence.
Uh-huh.
And in the second sentence, it says that you are liable for, and therefore you do have to pay tax that you're liable for. The question is, what are you liable for, right?
Okay.
Yeah, let's say the personal noun, am I correct?
The
It's
personal
not there.
pronoun.
Pronoun, I mean, it's not
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, the personal pronoun is missing from the first sentence. Now let's read it with the personal pronoun in the first sentence. Our legal right to ask you for information is Internal Revenue Code 6001, 6011, 6012A, and their regulations, but it doesn't say that, does it? Right? So they're not asking you, are they? It just says that our legal right to ask for information in these code sections, but they're not saying to you. All right? Now let's look at the second sentence. They say that you must file a return or statement for any tax you're liable for. Right? And so that doesn't say that you're liable for any tax. Who makes the determination according to that sentence? You do. Everybody understand that? Now, that's your first example of how slick they are when they write. The people who put these things together are not equal opportunity employment employees.
Are they lawyers, Joe?
All right?
Are they lawyers?
I think the ones who put these together are lawyers with a lot of training. And you see, that's your first example of how slick they can be when they write to you. Once you understand how the code is imposed by the law, a lot of these publications and all, it just jumps right off the page at you. But if you don't have this background and you read them, you think it's you that you're reading about. And then, you know, they're very slick in doing that. I think Willie fits right in. Now, you hear in a lot of states about this driver's license and the Social Security number, which is under 6109. And in fact, we have some states that have already capitulated. We have a case in Pennsylvania against the governor and the director of transportation. And here we had a case in Maryland which didn't even get to the courts with my daughter-in-law, who a couple years ago went to renew her license. And they told her that they weren't going to renew the license without a Social Security number. And she wrote none in the application, and they told her they weren't going to do that. In fact, they got right forceful and forced her to leave the office. So she came over to the office here, and I gave her a copy of the Maryland law regarding that, which we have right here. It's Title 11, Department of Transportation, Subtitle 17, Motor Vehicle Administration, Driver's License, and Identification Documents. As we go down under 2, it tells us disclosure. An applicant for an original, renewed, duplicate, or corrected identification document shall disclose the applicant's Social Security number. If the applicant does not have a Social Security number, the applicant shall certify that fact in the application. Now, at that time, all you heard over the radio and the television, from now on, you got to put your Social Security number. You got to have a Social Security number before you get the license. You go into the DMV, they had signs all over the place. No license without a Social Security number. You must have a Social Security number. The law doesn't say that at all. Just one more example of our government, how honest it's become. You know, the bureaucracies and all. It doesn't say it. The thing to do in any case when you don't have a Social Security number and you fill out an application that calls for it for any reason, you write none in there. You don't put zeros in because zeros are numbers, right? And if you put zeros in, then you can be fined and they can move to have backup withholding where the simple reason is you put the wrong number in. It's just that simple. It's a word game when you play with the law. So like the law says, the proper thing to do is to write none whenever he calls for one if you don't have one. If you have one, the only person you have to give it to is the government. You don't have to give it to anyone else. Of course, if it's a private industry like the bank, and the bank wants it, and you don't give it to them, then they don't have to do business with you. Or if it's a credit card company, they don't have to do business with you. Or anybody in the private sector. You cannot force them because they don't come under the same laws the government comes under. But you don't have to disclose your Social Security number to anyone. No one at all. If you file a return, then you've got to give it to the government when you file a return. You don't have to, in other words, if we'll get into it a little later on, but I'll mention it right here and now. If you're working for an employer, and the employer has an employer identification number, and he asks you for a Social Security number, you don't have to give it to him either. The law doesn't require that, and we'll show you that a little later on. And no one can require you to use it, but if you file a return, you got to put it on the return. That's the law. And it's just the way it showed you on the Notice 609. It's no different. So anyway, she took back and showed them the law, and they said, if you don't get out of here, we're going to call the police. So to make a long story short, we started writing the head of the Department of Transportation for the state of Maryland. And what happened was, after a series of letters going back and forth, because actually my daughter-in-law had never even made an application for a Social Security number. Her mother got one for her, which is the case in a lot of families. So she never made the application. Nobody can be held to something they never did. And I brought this to the attention of the head of the Department of Transportation for Maryland. And I told them, if they want to go to court and we want to argue about this, that's fine with us. We'll go. And as soon as I told them we were going to court, then they wrote back and said, go ahead and get your license. And when she walked in there, it was a different attitude. They just swept her right on through and they gave her license. No problem at all. They do not want that in court. We had another fellow who went to court recently. And in fact, we're still in court arguing. And he filed under the Maryland laws for minors to vacate his application, which was made when he was a minor. And it has nothing to do, it's not an adversarial proceeding at all. He's not arguing with the government, he just says he wants to vacate that because he was a minor when he made it. And he has every right to do that under the minor laws. And man, those judges, they didn't want to take it. It's like, I got a hot potato in my hand. Now, if you stop and think, no judge wants to be the first one to bring the house of cards down. And are they fighting us in Maryland? We're right now contemplating, because we went in there 3 or 4 times from different angles, and we're now contemplating filing a Title 42 suit against the judges for a violation of rights because they're depriving him of the court. He has every right to go to that court. They're denying him due process in court under the law of Maryland. And they don't want any part of that. I did hear just this week that in the state of Missouri, a judge just gave us a favorable ruling. So, so things are progressing, and you can't hide the truth forever. I mean, the truth comes out. It might take some time, but the truth always comes out. You cannot hide it. So anyway, we'll look at these other code sections that they had in Notice 609. And here we have section 6001. Notice what it says. Notice or regulations requiring record statements and special returns. Every person liable. Now on the 609, they sent that to you. Does it say, you, the citizen of the state of Maryland? When the IRS writes you, they always have a tendency of saying, dear taxpayer. Right? What do you think that means if they call you a dear taxpayer and you agree with them? That means that you're a taxpayer, right? If you agree with them. And they always say, dear taxpayer. But you have to understand, when you're dealing with law, you're dealing with legal terms. If you're a taxpayer, you go to the Internal Revenue Code and look up the term taxpayer, and it says, anyone who's subject to the taxes within this law. You're a taxpayer. It makes sense. But people think of themselves as a taxpayer because they pay sales tax, property tax, and all these other taxes, and they just go right on along the line. But there's a big difference. You can be a taxpayer, 2 words, and pay your property tax, but in the Internal Revenue Code, taxpayer is 1 word. Right? And it's totally different than taxpayer paying property taxes. And that term, being 1 word, means you're subject to the Internal Revenue Code. Now we'll go look at 6011 and see what that says, because this here, 1 is the liability and 11 is the requirement, general requirement of return statement or list. General rule, when required by regulations prescribed by the Secretary, any person made liable for any tax imposed by this title. What does the word title mean? Anybody know what the word title means? Anybody know what the word title means? Title 26. In other words, the United States Code has 50 titles. The Internal Revenue Code is Title 26 of the 50 titles. So whenever you see the word within any particular title, if you're in Title 12 and you see the word title, it means Title 12. Well, we're in Title 26 now, so that means imposed by this title, which is the Internal Revenue Code, Title 26. Or for the collection thereof, shall make a return or statement according to the forms and regulations prescribed by the Secretary. But it's what? When required. Now, if everybody had to pay the tax, what would it say? It would say always required, not when required. And everybody would be required all the time. And it would be on Notice 609 in more detail. You would have the personal pronoun in both sentences. And you would have these saying, what? Individual? Would it say, what would it actually say? Well, I mean, if everybody was required, what would it actually say? Would it say taxpayer? Would it say individual? What would it say? It would say citizens. That's correct. It would say all citizens of the United States and all citizens of the federal states and all resident aliens within the United States and within the federal states. That's what it would say. If everybody was required, it would say so. But they use the word taxpayer, and they use the word individual, and they use the word person, right? And people just, when they read that, not having any legal training in the most part, they just think of, well, that's me. I'm an individual, I'm a person, I'm a taxpayer, right? You have a question?
Yeah. Usually you see the word resident also in those statements, but never citizen sometimes.
That's correct. A resident is not the same as a citizen. Let's say that you live in 2 states. Some people live in 2 states. They'll have a house in the south and go there in the winter, and have a house in the north and go there in the summer. Now, they can't be a citizen of 2 states, but yet they'll split the year in 6 months. You see? So what they are, they're a citizen in one state and a resident in the other. A resident is not a citizen. In the state of Maryland, a resident owes the income tax. And when you check out the income tax law for Maryland, it talks about a resident, and the resident turns out to be a corporation. You see? So you can go to Delaware and get a Delaware corporation and come to Maryland and do business with the Delaware corporation, and that's a resident. Okay, and you wind up paying the tax. So that's another one there, but that pertains more or less to do excises and duties and imposts and things of that nature when you get to residency. Because if you're a foreign resident, you have to be a resident alien or a non-resident alien, one or the other. So. All right, so we're starting to get an idea about this. Now, 6012, we're going to reserve to later on tonight. We're not going to get into that for a good reason, but you'll see then. All right, now that the 609 didn't tell us a thing, did it? I mean, here they are, they wrote us, and they asked us for a tax return. And they sent us a 609 to show what our legal right is, and we just examined that, and we didn't find out. We don't know any more what we knew before, do we? So that means that we have to what? Do our own investigation, right? So where do we go?
The index.
Huh?
Am I right?
Definition?
Index
Yeah, well, you would go, what index?
of Title
Wow.
26.
All right, okay, that's a good idea. You go, when you want to find out something, you go to the index. That's correct. All right, now when you go to the index, what do you look up?
Withholding?
60, 12, 60,
You look up what? You look up withholding? All right, then what are you going to find if you look up withholding? You're withholding a lot of things.
Agent?
Huh?
I looked up liable.
Look up liable? Well, liable will take you right back to where we were, I think.
Taxpayer?
Probably withholding agent, am I correct?
Oh, okay. Well, let's look at the withholding agent. Why do you say the withholding agent?
Because the tax, I'm thinking, would not be on us, it would be on someone else.
Well, I mean, why would you say the withholding agent?
They're withholding
Huh?
money.
Because he's a taxpayer.
Well, I guess he does pay a tax. Why would he pay a tax? Because he's taking it from somebody. So if the withholding agent is to take it from somebody, then they have to tell him what? Who to take it from. Right? Okay, they got to tell him who to take it from. And then, of course, when he takes it from them, who does he give it to? Internal Revenue Service. So he takes it from them and gives it to the Internal Revenue Service, right? Then we see the word withholding agent in Treasury Decision 2313 just a little while ago. Remember that? It talked about the withholding agent, withholding from non-resident aliens. All right. Now let's go look at it. Here's the index, and we got the W's. We're wines withholdings. Now we'll go down here and we'll find withholding agent. Here we are right here. Withholding agent. And it says defined in section 7701A16. So now we got to go to section 7701A16 to find out who he has to withhold from. Now, what we're doing now is we're going to chapter 79 of the Internal Revenue Code, which is in subtitle, what subtitle is it in?
That would be 27, am I right?
No, which subtitle is chapter 79 in? Come on, students, let's go. F, that's right, Bruce, subtitle F. What's subtitle F? Procedures and Administration. All right, so chapter 79 is in subtitle F, section 7701. Why do legal terms within a law have to be defined? Everybody knows what the words mean. You know what the word person means, right?
Not in law.
Huh?
In law, they're different.
Well, it's the English language, isn't it?
There
It's different in law.
Huh?
There can be more than one definition for a word. Even in the dictionary, when you look it up, there can be more than one specific definition.
Well, that's
So
correct.
we have to know which definition they're referring to.
Well, do we speak the King's English?
Not anymore.
Well, what happened? I mean, somewhere along the line, we were speaking the King's English, and then somewhere along the line, it's changed, right? I mean, if we go to England, It doesn't even seem, I mean, we go, whoa, what are these people talking about, right? Well, what causes that?
Well, a statute can be struck down if it's vague and overbroad.
Well, that's correct. But what causes changes in language?
New people coming into the country.
Slang. Right? Slang. People change language with slang. Oh, there's a good example. How many ever saw the Kentucky Fried Chicken commercial where all the musicians are taking a break? And the musicians are, around the age of 20 to 30. And they show one old geezer about my age, and he's like off to himself, you know. And he must be the stagehand or whatever. And they're all eating fried chicken. And all the young musicians are saying, man, this chicken's bad. And they show him, and he's sitting there, and he says, I think it's rather good myself. Right? So what would happen if we had a jury? Right? and the jury, half the jury was from the age of 20 to 30, and the other half of the jury was 55 to 65. Right? And then you had a young lawyer for the defense and an old lawyer for the prosecution, and here they are examining a witness who says, man, that's bad. So what do you have? You have half the jury thinking it's good and the other half thinking it's bad, and both lawyers think they're making out. Right? So that's an example of how language changes, right? And why law has to be defined. Okay, everybody understand now why law has to be defined? Okay, now we got definitions, which is section 7701, and we go to A. And the first one we come up with is the definition of person. Well, everybody knows that a person, you and I, we're persons, blood, flesh, and bones, right? Well, look what it says. The term person shall be construed to mean and include an individual, trust, estate, partnership, association, company, or corporation. So when you read the term person in a code section, what could it mean? Does it not necessarily mean a human being? No, it could be any one of those entities. All right, so then you got to find out what it's talking about. So that means in law, you cannot read a code section without reading the whole chapter to see what the chapter is all about. Right? If you read a code section, then you could be misguided.
Out of context.
Everything's out of context. So you have to understand the scheme of what's going on, you see? All right, now understanding that, we're going to go to 7701A16. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 7701A16 out of two codes. The first code we're going to show you is the 1954 code, the 1982 edition. Now, you know, the first time that the law was codified in the United States was 1926. Then it was recodified in 1939. I'm talking about the Internal Revenue Code now. In 1939. And then it was recodified again in 1954. And then recodified again in 1986. Now that doesn't mean that the whole thing was changed radically of the provisions that were there. In fact, the provisions that were there from 1861 are still there. But that means that they've made additions in those years. In 1986, they added what they called TEFRA. Remember when that term was flying around, TEFRA? So they recodified to add TEFRA there, which is a windfall profit tax on oil. Remember that? That's all you heard in the news. So they had a whole new thing called TEFRA, so they recodified. Now, in the Internal Revenue Code, it was written in 1861, and it was called the Bureau of Internal Revenue. In 1954, it got a name change to Internal Revenue Service. Remember, that's very important to remember that. The reason why I say that is because a person from the state of Maryland was over in Delaware one time, some years ago, might be 10 years ago now. And he was, a lot of people, when they start finding out what's going on, they don't want to really say that their government is lying. Nobody wants to believe their government is lying. Everybody wants to look at the bright side of things. Hardly anybody wants to look at the wrong side of things, the bad side of things. And so a lot of people were studying this, and they were trying to find what the government was doing. It must be something that's causing the courts to rule these ways. So anyway, he was over digging in the land records in Delaware, and he found in the land records over there was a corporation called the Internal Revenue Service. So right away he jumped to a conclusion. He knew that the Federal Reserve Bank was a private bank. So here he said, well, what we have in his mind was a private bank who formed a private agency to collect its money. And then he built the whole scenario around this and put together a speech and started traveling the country and preaching it. And people bought it. I mean, a fellow by the name of Philip Marsh, who started an organization called the Poly Connection, preached that. And I mean to tell you, I think when they finally charged him with consumer fraud, because nothing could be further from the truth. Because the Internal Revenue Service was created by an act of Congress. So, but anyway, he got the name changed in '54, and if he would have studied further, he would have understood that, because the corporation called the Internal Revenue Service was incorporated in 1935. See? That was some years before the name change. At that time, it was called the Bureau of Internal Revenue. So never jump at these things. You have to check them out. Don't take anything at face value. I mean, we get things in here all the time that people send us. And we don't repeat them. We check them out. We learned that long ago. You never repeat any of these things. You check them out thoroughly before you go forward with them. Any which way, so we have the 1954 Code, 1982 edition, and we have the 1986 Code, 1990 edition. That's what we're going to look at. So let's first go to the 54 Code, 82 edition, and we'll look at 7701A16, the definition of withholding agent. And we have it right here, 16. Withholding agent. The term withholding agent means any person required to deduct and withhold any tax under the provisions of Section 1441, 1442, 1443, 1451, 1461, and 3451. Now notice they say the source section, see it right here in the footnotes, the source section is 3797A16 of the 39 Code. So when they recodified in 54, they took section 3797A16 and they made it 7701A16. But they put the source here, you see. Everybody understand that? So we have 6 code sections. Now notice that they all begin with a 14 except one. Why is that?
A different section.
Hmm?
A different section of the code.
Different part. Yeah, that's right. That's totally correct. Every code section that begins with a 14 you find in chapter 3. And every code section beginning with 34 you find in chapter 24. Does anybody know what subtitles they are? Are they both the same subtitle? What is a subtitle? Anybody know what a subtitle is?
A division of the application of the law?
Division of the application of the law. It's totally correct. It's a division. There are 10 subtitles, which we're going to get into later in the code. 10. The first 5 are different categories of taxation. The 6th subtitle is the general provisions, which is subtitle F. And then the last 4 are miscellaneous. We'll get into them later. So here we have how many subtitles?
2. 2 different ones.
2 different subtitles. That's correct. Anybody know what they are? First, 14 would be A, right? What is the 34 in chapter 24? That's right, subtitle C. Totally correct. So we have subtitle A and subtitle C that we're dealing with here. 2 subtitles, right? It's very important. That's why I magnified that. It's very important we understand this. This is part of the secret of understanding the code. Now we're going to go to the other one. The 1986 edition, code, 90 edition. And we got 7701A16. Withholding agent. The term withholding agent means any person required to deduct and withhold any tax under the provisions of sections 1441, 1442, 1443, or 1461. Is there a difference?
3451 dropped out.
3451 dropped out. Is that all? And 1451 dropped. 2 of them dropped out. Now we have 4. So, and then there were 4. Now how many subtitles do we have? 1. What happened to the other subtitle? All right. So A and C would be in the first 5 subtitles, right, which are different categories of taxation. So all of a sudden, one category of taxation is no longer to be withheld from, right? Now, something had to happen, didn't it? Now, we wrote the IRS, and they don't tell us what happened. They don't have an answer for it. I don't understand that. I mean, we're constantly asking these questions, and they constantly ignore us. Sometimes we really keep pressing them, and some of them get excited. And one time I was pressing this one lawyer over there in Washington, D.C. in public relations, and she got so upset that she sent a memo back to her chief and sent me a copy of it saying, I told you I can't answer him, somebody else has to answer him. So, I mean, that's great to have. So anyway, now we have a drastic difference, right? And we got to magnify on that difference. There's a lot of keys there to the story. All right, we'll go to section 1441. That's the first one, right? Withholding of tax on all U.S. citizens within the states of the Union. What does it say? It doesn't say that. Huh? Doesn't it say withholding of tax on all U.S. citizens within the states of the Union? No. Withholding of tax on what? Non-resident aliens. All right, he can withhold. Well, the next one must be U.S. citizens, right? How many people have withholdings from their anybody has withholdings? Right. Well, you have to be here then, don't you? All right. Let's go to 1442. Withholding a tax on all U.S. corporations. Huh? Oh, foreign corporations. Well, where's the U.S. corporations? Well, we got. How many more we got to go? We got 4 more to go. 2 or 4? Did we start out with 6? Right, we started out with 6, didn't we? All right, here's 1443. Oh, withholding a tax on all U.S. churches with a 501c3 exemption. Huh? Say it? Doesn't it say that? Isn't that right, Joe? Joe's a preacher, isn't that right? Can't you see that, Joe? No, foreign tax exempt organizations. Well, if that's the case, if this has to do with tax exempt organizations and they have to be foreign, why do all these churches get 501c3 exemptions? Right? Clinton spoke down there, they might lose their exemption. Right? And then he's speaking at church and use it for a political forum. Right? They can use their exemption. All right, and that's 3 of them. Let's go to 1451. Withholding of tax-free covenant bonds. How about that? In any case where bonds, mortgages, or deeds of trust or other similar obligations of a corporation issued January 1934 containing a contract or provision by which the obligator agrees to pay any portion of the tax imposed by this subtitle on the obligee or reimburse the obligee for any portion of the tax or pay any interest without deduction for a tax which the obligor may be required or permitted to pay thereon. Who's the obligee and the obligor? What is this talking about here?
Corporations.
Huh?
Foreign, make the treaties as such, am I right?
Huh? What's this talking about here? Well, it's in chapter 3.
What's all of chapter 3?
Huh?
What is chapter 3?
Foreign.
All
It's
All
foreign.
is foreign.
Yeah, chapter 3 is foreign. All right.
So that provision.
So that was dropped because they stopped taxing the interest and dividends of foreigners in this country. All right. That's why that was dropped. Well, let's look at 3451. This is subtitle C, 3451. That was repealed, and so this was repealed too. That's why it's no longer in the 90 edition of the 86 Code. Income tax collected at source on interest dividends and patronage dividends. Now, this was repealed. Requiring withholding except as otherwise provided in this subchapter, the payor of the interest, the dividend and patronage dividend, shall withhold a tax equal to 10% of the amount of the payment. Who's this dealing with?
Well, the bank or whoever was paying the interest to whoever owned.
Well, who is this talking to? Who are these sections talking to?
Well, it's talking
Foreign.
to
Withholding.
Withholding agents. These sections are talking to withholding agents. Is that correct? Now, here it's telling them to withhold 10% of the amount paid in chapter 24. Who does that pertain to? I mean, the withholding agent in the 1954 Code 82 edition was told to withhold interest and dividends from foreigners and from who here?
Non-resident aliens here.
Huh?
Non-resident aliens living here, right?
Would that be it?
I don't know.
Who is it? I mean, if all they need is one code section to withhold interest and dividends, why not just use 1451? Why have 3451? There must be a difference, or they wouldn't have two code sections and two parts of the code, would they? Right? Is that correct? Well, sure it's correct. Well, who does it pertain to?
Citizens?
Could be. Who else? Who does it actually pertain to?
Banks?
Mainly to the withholding.
Well, the financial institution evidently is the person, Because a person is what? Is a corporation, trust, estate, right? Right? So that's what, so we're talking about a lending institution or a brokerage house, someone who's paying interest, right? Or dividends, and they're to withhold 10% from who?
From the person that's receiving the interest.
Well, who is that, dear?
That is,
Whoever owns the dividend.
Anyone?
Or their patronage.
Anyone at all?
no, it's only for people that's got treaties with us.
Are you sure? I mean, I thought the other one was that. I thought the other one was that. Who would this be? Why have two code sections? Don't you question that? Why have two code sections for the same thing? Both of them are 51. Only one's 1451. The other one's 3451. They were both repealed. So who are they? Whose interest in dividends are they?
Foreign earned,
Oh, I don't think so. I don't know. I don't know. Was it? Whose? Everyone who has a Social Security number. Everyone. That's who they're talking to. Huh? That's who they're talking to. All right.
All right, I understand now.
Now it becomes, the light goes off, right? Becomes evident, right? Does everybody understand that?
then why was it dropped?
Huh?
Why was it dropped?
Well, just because they were withholding from everyone with a Social Security number, does that make it right?
Pollock case.
There you go. There's a gentleman that understands. What does it mean, the Pollock case? Well, didn't we talk about the Pollock case just a little while ago? What did the Pollock case say?
Income taxes and indirect tax?
No, that was the Bershaber case and the Stanton case. What did the Pollock case say?
Direct tax on dividends and interest of citizens was
It was
unconstitutional.
unconstitutional. The case has never been overturned. Pollock still stands. And in 1895, Pollock says the interest and dividends, the tax on interest and dividends of citizens was unconstitutional, a direct tax without apportionment. Within the states, of course, they're talking about.
How many years, though, did it stand, and can the people go back?
How many years it's still standing?
The 3451?
No, that's not standing. Pollock is still standing.
Right.
3451 was enacted and was repealed.
How long was it in effect before it was
I'd have to check I never checked when they passed it. They repealed it with the 86 code.
Why? I mean, do you know why they repealed it?
I don't know. I don't know why they repealed it. Quite possibly somebody woke up and said, hey, they had the Pollock case. Right? But there's other thoughts along those lines that you got to think about, which we'll get into later when we start looking with a magnifying glass at subtitle C. But you got to keep these things in mind, because when you fully understand the law, nobody can take you down a primrose path. I had a gentleman come in my office yesterday, and he came in there, and he belongs to one of these, some kind of a corporation, that's a limited liability corporation that comes under the code. And he heard me say that subtitle A is under tax treaties. And he says, well, the publication that goes along with the 1065, which is a corporation return, right, for self-employment, says if I don't file this form K1, then the other limited partners of the corporation are penalized. So I can't have them penalized. And he says, evidently I have a requirement to file this thing. And I said, well, what does it pertain to? He said, well, self-employment. Now, we're going to show you this a little later on. I said, well, what code section is self-employment? And he said, well, I don't know. I said, well, which code section is it calling for K1? He said, I don't know. I said, well, let's go and look. And so we started looking. Self-employment is section 1401. Does that tell you something? Right? So after we discovered that self-employment was section 1401, then we started to say, well, it pertains to self-employment to citizens here in this country, right? So after we saw that, then I said, well, show me your K-1 form. He got the K-1 form out, and I rolled it over, and it started talking right on the back of the form. Enter all your foreign earned income here. I mean, it tells you right on the form. I said, well, did you have any foreign earned income? He said, no. I said, well, how can you enter something you didn't have? I mean, that's what the form said. The scheme of the Internal Revenue law hasn't changed from 1861. And we showed the first Income Tax Act just a little while ago. Yeah, and say we showed that just a little while ago, and it said an act to increase revenue from imports. And the first Income Tax Act was called, anybody remember? Income Duty.
In this tape, we examined the power to tax and learned that in 1895, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to tax the income of U.S. citizens. Of course, the average American would quickly add that Congress passed the 16th Amendment, as if this changed everything. However, most Americans are unaware that in the case of Stanton versus Baltic Mining, the Supreme Court ruled quite the opposite when it said, the 16th Amendment conferred no new power of taxation. So, if it was unconstitutional to tax the income of U.S. citizens before the 16th Amendment, and the amendment conferred no new power of taxation, then it would be just as unconstitutional to tax the income of citizens after the 16th Amendment. Indeed. We then showed that according to the law, the income of U.S. citizens living and working within the 50 states is not the subject of the income tax. To the contrary, the law requires the income tax to be withheld only from non-resident aliens, foreign corporations, and certain foreign organizations. The law does not require income tax to be withheld from U.S. citizens. This was acknowledged by the government in 1916 when Treasury Decision 2313 was issued by the Commissioner of the IRS to explain that it was the income of non-resident aliens that was subject to the tax, and that it was the responsible heads, agents, or representatives of non-resident aliens that were required to fill out Form 1040 income tax returns for their non-resident alien principals. We also discovered that the government does not need an income tax to raise revenue. It does, however, need some mechanism, real or imaginary, to remove excess paper money from circulation, because without such control, the value of paper money would decrease geometrically, just like the Continental. We then showed that the term taxpayer, as used by the IRS, is a legal definition pertaining to persons who are made liable for a tax under the Internal Revenue Code, and that persons who are not specifically made liable by statute are not taxpayers as defined by the law. We also examined the government's definition of a tax protester and found that, according to Section 5431.4 of the Internal Revenue Manual, a tax protester is someone who files a return and writes a protest on the return. Such individuals usually protest their legal obligation to file returns and pay taxes. However, if the law does not require you to file a return or pay a tax and you act accordingly, then you can't very well be a tax protester.